Welcome to the lesson Introduction to Machine Learning Classification Algorithms. The objectives of this lesson are to first discuss the goals of classification. We will then describe the decision tree algorithm, followed by a description of the random forest algorithm, which uses decision trees, and we will describe the single-layer perceptron algorithm. Finally, we define how to measure the performance of a classification algorithm. In this first section, we discussed the goals of classification. Recall the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. In supervised learning, we have features, say x1, x2, up to xb, that the algorithm uses to predict a target or label, say y. In unsupervised algorithms, we do not use a target associated with the features. Classification, which is the topic of this lesson, is a supervised algorithm. So it requires us providing a target label to predict. What can we classify in space biology? Classification involves the training of a machine learning algorithm to classify input features into a finite number of classes. This slide shows an example of using the feature space representing RNA sequencing data as predictors of low or high intraocular pressure, a phenotypic response to spaceflight. In this example, we wish to train a binary machine learning classifier, i.e. one with two outcomes, that can examine RNA transcript counts to determine whether the intraocular pressure in the sample's eye is low or high. If a machine learning classifier can predict whether the IOP value will be low or high based on the gene expression, then we can identify which genes are responsible for that effect. Knowing which genes are responding to spaceflight may help us diagnose, monitor, or even prevent this effect. In this section, we describe our first machine learning classifier, one which you've probably already seen, the decision tree. A decision tree is a form of graph that has a singular root, the starting point of the decisions, and in each decision node, a yes or no or true or false question is asked of the data. The tree then branches into children nodes based on the answer to that question, and each of those subsequent children nodes ask true or false or yes or no questions, and it continues to branch in this way until all the nodes are classified in the leaf nodes. The questions do not need to be binary. In other words, they don't have to have two possible answers. They happen to in this diagram, but they can have multiple answers, as we will see in the next slide. In this example decision tree, we've constructed a decision tree to classify a fruit given its color, size, shape, and taste. Starting at the top level, which is called the root node or level 0, the tree asks the question, what is the color of the fruit? If the answer is green, then the tree branches to the next question, what is the size of the fruit? If the answer is big, then the decision tree decides that the fruit must be a watermelon since it's green and big. If the size is medium, the decision tree decides the fruit is an apple since it's green and medium-sized. And if the answer is small, the decision tree decides the fruit is a grape, since it's green and small. All the leaf nodes in the decision tree, those at the very bottom in level 2 and level 3 there, and basically the ones that are colored red, represent the decisions, i.e. the classifications of the fruit given the data color, size, shape, and taste. In this decision tree, the model first asks the question, is the gene count for 74978 less than 0.553? If the answer is true, it then asks the question, is the gene 103556 count less than or equal to 0.47? If the answer to the second question is true, then 12.5% of the sample values are classified as low. The first number in the list of values is low, and the second number is high. If the answer is false, then 50% of the samples are classified as high. So you can see that the percentage of all the node's children must add up to that node's percentage of the samples. In this case, 12.5% plus 50% equals 62.5%. Going back to the first question at the root node in level 0, if the answer is false, then all of those samples, which constitute the remaining 37.5% of the data, are classified as low. In this tree, we only needed 2 gene expression values to classify all the samples' IOP measurements as low or high. Please note that these fractional gene count values, which are normally integers, are due to the fact that the data were standardized first, and we'll discuss that in another lesson. Informally, information gain is a method to quantify the goodness of the question being asked at a node in a decision tree. The best questions asked in a parent node separate one class from another in their children nodes. The worst questions don't do anything to distinguish one class from another in their children nodes. In this way, information gain is a quantitative measure that measures how much information is gained, i.e., how well does the question separate one class from another by asking that question. The questions are derived from the input features, and some questions are better than others. In this example, the root node has 30 total samples, 16 samples in the blue circle class, and 14 samples that belong to the gold star class. Asking the question, is the value of x1 less than 100, classifies all but one sample as blue. And the question, is the value of x1 greater than or equal to 100, classifies all but 4 samples as gold stars. It's not a perfect separation of the classes in the children nodes, but it seems like this question gained a lot of information in the decision tree. Entropy is a measure of surprise or uncertainty, and if you were to blindly select a sample from the root node, the top node in this tree, you'd have a roughly 50-50% chance of getting either a blue circle or a gold star. And if you were to replace that sample and continue this experiment on and on, you would select approximately half blue and half gold stars. And each time that you did your selection, you wouldn't have any idea what the outcome would be. For that reason, we say that the root node has high entropy. On the other hand, if you were to repeat that experiment of blindly selecting a sample with replacement from, say, the left node, on the one on the bottom left, you'd likely select a blue circle, and you wouldn't be very surprised by that outcome. For that node, we say the entropy is low. Formally, information gain is the difference in entropy between the parent node and the sum of its children nodes. Entropy is beyond the scope of this course, but worth looking into for greater understanding of machine learning. In this section, we'll describe the random forest algorithm, which is built on multiple decision trees. A random forest is comprised of multiple decision trees, thus the name forest. Each tree is created by using a subset of the training data selected at random and with replacement, thus the name random. After all the trees in the forest are trained, the model passes the data through each tree to reach a classification, i.e., a decision, for that input. The model chooses the classification that the majority of the trees voted for as the final result of the model. A hyperparameter of a model is a configurable parameter that affects how a machine learning algorithm behaves. In the case of the decision tree, one hyperparameter you can define is the maximum depth of the tree. How many levels are there? This guides the decision tree algorithm and tells it not to have levels go deeper than a certain value. This prevents overfitting, which we'll talk about later in this lesson. Another hyperparameter of a decision tree is which metric to use for information gain. We discussed the use of entropy earlier in this lesson, but there are other metrics which we won't discuss here. Because random forests are a collection of decision trees, all the hyperparameters that apply to decision trees also apply to the random forest. Plus, it has additional hyperparameters such as the maximum number of trees to build in the forest. In this section, we describe the single-layer perceptron member of the family of supervised learning algorithms. This is a diagram of a single brain cell, the neuron. There are approximately 100 billion neurons in the adult human brain, and they are very highly connected. The dendrites on the left side of the diagram connect to the axon terminals of other neurons, and the axon terminals on the right side of the diagram connect to the dendrites of other neurons. There are an estimated 100 trillion connections in the adult human brain. Some connections are stronger than others. These we call weights. A neuron collects its electrical input from upstream neurons through its dendrites, and once a threshold of input is reached, the neuron fires a signal out through its axon terminals, sending signals downstream through its axon terminals. A neuron fires between 2 and 5 times per second on average. Back in the 1950s, scientists created the artificial neuron, which is modeled after the biological neuron. In this diagram, the inputs x1 through xn are akin to the biological neuron dendrites. Those inputs are summed, represented by the sigma symbol, and when a certain threshold is reached, represented by the activation function, the artificial neuron fires output to downstream artificial neurons. This is a single-layer perceptron model that is trained to perform a very simple task. It takes as input a grid in which a handwritten digit is placed. This particular grid has 4 rows and 3 columns, so 12 cells in all. If a cell has some handwriting in it from the digit, we put a 1 for that cell. If a cell is empty, we put a 0 for that cell. We then take all those 1s and 0s, multiply by a weight, add them up, and if the sum is greater than a threshold, we fire a 1 to indicate the number is odd. If the number is less than the threshold, we fire a 0 to indicate the number is even. The single-layer perceptron learns those weights W1 to W12 in an iterative process we discuss in the next slide. The activation function in this case is called the step function because it looks like a step. The horizontal axis represents the sum, and once you cross a certain sum, you take that step up. There are many activation functions available, but we won't discuss them here. So this is the single-layer perceptron training algorithm in a form of pseudocode. The input to the algorithm is a set of points x1, y1, x2, y2, up to xn, yn. So this is labeled data. X1 through xn are the features, the predictors, and y1 through yn are the targets or the labels. So we have labeled data. The output of the model is the set of weights that are multiplied by each input x. The initial values of the weights are set to 0. We could also set them to some random numbers, but in this particular case, we'll set them to 0. And then we iterate through lines 4, 5, and 6 until what's called model convergence, which is either when the weights stop getting updated, in other words, we found the minimum error, or when the some number of iterations is reached, because we can't do this forever. For each input xi, we multiply the xi by the weights and get a sum. If the answer is correct, we continue to the next point in the data set. If the answer is wrong, i.e. the predicted value f of xi is not equal to the actual value yi, then we update the weights and continue learning. The single-layer perceptron was found to be too simplistic a model for certain tasks and was later replaced with multi-layer perceptrons, or MLPs. MLPs have an input layer and an output layer just like the SLP, but additionally has one or more hidden layers. The number of hidden layers and the number of nodes per layer are 2 hyperparameters of the MLP. The more nodes and more layers in the model, the more complexity the model can capture in the dataset. In this section, we discuss how to measure the performance of classification algorithms. Accuracy is the most common metric used to evaluate a classification algorithm. It's like a score a student gets on an exam, the number of correct answers divided by the total number of questions. In binary classification, there are 2 possible outcomes, positive and negative, 0 and 1, true or false, whatever. For this discussion, we'll say that the 2 outcomes or classes are called positive and negative. There's a concept of a true and false positive and a true and false negative. A true positive is a prediction of positive when the actual value is positive. A true negative is a prediction of negative when the actual value was negative. A false positive is a prediction of positive when the actual value is negative, and a false negative is a prediction of negative when the actual value is positive. In binary classification, if you build a model which just flips a fair 2-sided coin and assigns one value to heads and the other value to tails, over time you would expect to get the answer correct about 50% of the time. This baseline performance is not informed at all by the data and is often referred to as the null model. In machine learning, we strive to build models that do better than the null model. Model accuracy usually improves the longer you train a model. So you can see on the x-axis, we have the iterations, and the y-axis, we have the accuracy. And it keeps going up and up until there's a certain point, some point of inflection where it kind of starts to flatten out, and then you get diminishing returns. We say that at that point, the model has converged and you can stop training. Another reason to stop training a model is when you've reached a certain predefined number of iterations and the accuracy is no longer improving. So we call these stop conditions for when to stop training. Accuracy is not always the best metric to use when evaluating a machine learning model. For example, if you have a data set which is heavily biased in favor of a particular outcome, then you could just design your model to always predict the outcome and it will mostly be correct. Suppose, as in this slide, the data set is comprised of the green class with 95% and the red class with 5%. You could just design a model that always predicts green and it would be on average correct 95% of the time. This is called an imbalanced data set, and just one reason accuracy is not always the best metric. Another reason accuracy is not always a good metric is when there's some cost and benefit associated with a classification. In the slide's contrived example, the cost of classifying the green class incorrectly is $5, and the cost of misclassifying the red class is $500. We'd need to do what's called a cost-benefit analysis, which is beyond the scope of this course, but worth looking into to evaluate such a model. Cost and benefit are not necessarily represented as monetary values either. The cost of misclassification could be the cost of misdiagnosing a patient with a fatal disease, for example. Another way to evaluate a classification model is by using a confusion matrix. The confusion matrix on the left is for binary classification when there's only positive and negative. Suppose you've designed a flu test. A true positive is a diagnosis of a person having the flu when they really do have the flu, and a true negative is a diagnosis of a person being healthy when they really are healthy. A false positive is a diagnosis of a person having the flu when in fact they're really healthy, and a false negative is a diagnosis of a person being healthy when in fact they really had the flu. The confusion matrix on the right is the generalization of the confusion matrix when there are more than two classes. The values along the diagonal in both cases represent correct classifications, and the values off of the diagonal represent incorrect classifications. This particular confusion matrix on the right measures the performance of a gene classifier that classifies or predicts genes based on some input. You can design a decision tree to fit every single data point in the training set, i.e. all the data points are leaves in the tree. But such a model would be considered overfit and would not generalize well to data it has not seen before. On the other hand, a model which is too generic, like the one on the left, is considered underfit and would also not generalize well to data it hasn't seen before. We wish to design our models, not just decision trees, but all of our models, to be just right, balanced, not overfit, and not underfit. There's a method called regularization, which penalizes a model for being too complex. In the case of decision trees, limiting to the depth of the tree and limiting the total number of decision nodes are two ways to regularize the model. Another technique is called pruning, where the algorithm will remove a portion of the decision tree after it's built. In this case, in the case of random forests, limiting the maximum number of trees in the forest is another way to regularize that model. And that brings us to the end of this lecture in which we discuss various concepts of classification from the supervised family of machine learning algorithms, including decision trees, random forests, single-layer perceptron, accuracy, confusion matrix, overfitting, and underfitting. In the hands-on activity, you will have the opportunity to use the algorithms and tools we learned in this lesson. Specifically, you'll use random forest and the single-layer perceptron to classify phenotypic responses using RNA-seq data as predictors.